Okay, first of all, full name and full name, gender you identify with, and age.
Okay, so my full name is Keely Bruce. I identify as a woman, female, and I'm 40 years old.
Okay, that's good. So, the theme of the project is role models and representation.
Sure.
So we're gonna be doing 3 parts.
Okay.
I already explained this to you, so this is gonna be in the description later on. So, starting with part 1, educational spectrum.
Okay.
We're gonna start with this first question. It's basically that a role is defining what a role model is. A role model is an individual which one projects onto what they desire to be better at, like in skills, morals, or physiology even.
Sure.
Bringing this into an educational system, would there be an importance in the lessons one would learn from these role models? What can children learn from them?
From role models in an educational sense?
Yeah.
I think maybe what children could learn most is like an engagement and a love of learning. I think if they look up to their educators, then they're more willing to, I think, be educated, or to associate, I think, like positive sorts of experiences and feelings with learning. So I think then that would continue on into adult living, right? This sort of love of learning and this excitement about learning and this engagement with learning. Whereas I think if children don't have positive role models in their educational systems, then they're not going to be that excited, I think, about what they're learning or learning in general, I think. So I think in a way, and I think we all have teachers that we would remember as like those teachers, like those
definitely.
teachers who just sort of changed something about the way that you interact with the world or something, right? And worth their weight in gold. You'll never forget those people. So that says something. And I think in some ways children, like we try to emulate those people. We try to sort of become like them in a way, right? We see these qualities that we admire and we sort of want to adapt ourselves, I think. So yeah, I mean, I think it's super important for kids. Yeah.
That's good. Going with that, we're gonna be talking about redefining gender. So according to Judith Butler, gender and sexuality are defined by performative acts, repeated and taken from history. So being that in an educational system, that would be like history classes and whatnot. Being that as it is, do you think the introduction of more representation and the freedom to follow any role model in a school environment would help a child redefine what gender is to them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And I think it's interesting because, I graduated high school in 1995. So, not that long ago, that all these ideas were there, and sort of in being talked about in a way. But, there were no out kids in my class. There was, if I think back now, there were certainly some that were, that weren't straight, like weren't heterosexual, like whatever else they might have been, right? But like they weren't out. There was no sort of like being a gay teenager or a transgender teenager or.
So by out you mean you're saying that from the term out of the closet, right?
Yeah, precisely. Like known as being gay or self-identified, or presenting in ways that didn't conform to the sort of that strict gender binary, right, that we all sort of are ascribed to. So yeah, I think if we look at even some of the younger people now, I think it's already becoming less prescribed. I think there's ideas, there's rules that are starting to shift and bend a little bit. And I think like representation and awareness are super important in school systems about diversity and different sort of gender expressions and about that sort of fluidity. But also representation, right? Also about like seeing if there's queer kids, having adults who identify as queer as well, or like And I think normalizing the language too, right? Like, talking about transgenderedness, talking about, different forms of sexuality, talking about gender with your children, I think is really important. And I don't think it's conversations that were happening 20 years ago, but they're certainly happening now. So, yeah, and it's exciting. I think it's important. I talk to my son about it as well. Nice. We talk about like gender and gender roles and how there's no rules with gender, right? Like it's not a concept that he sort of easily understands, but we talk about it, right?
Nice.
So, yeah, and I think a lot of parents are, a lot of educators are too,
So going with that last statement, you being a parent, teaching teaching your kids about gender and whatnot, what do you think about the adults in an individual's education? Like, and by individual, I don't just mean children. I also mean like young adults in college and whatnot.
Sure.
How do they guide and affect what role models they follow, and how do they find their gender? Like, I don't know if this happens to you, but some parents tend to like try to coerce their child towards one way or another.
Sure.
How do you think that affects their redefinition of gender?
Like on the child's individual
on the child's individual sense, like, and also a little bit on the adults. How do the adults learn from that?
Right. Well, I think it's interesting because when you have, or at least for me, my experience has been that even though I, for myself, would not wish to have a quote unquote normal life, I don't really, even though I'm a cisgendered heterosexual woman, I don't really ascribe to a lot of this sort of heteronormative behaviors or expectations. I think they're all sort of bullshit, right? So, but as a parent, my son, we're just sort of discovering that I think my son has some attention deficit problems, right? Some issues, and so there's these, these things that are arising that are sort of causing him some problems. And as a parent, it's kind of terrifying, the idea of your child not being, again, quote unquote normal, and it's an interesting space to inhabit, because I'm so scared for him on one hand, and it's a bit of an irrational fear because you can't really think about your children rationally. It's kind of, you're too far in, but yeah, the idea of him not being normal is kind of scary. And I've been thinking about why I fear that for him, even though it's not something I would wish on myself, right? And I think it's because kids can be really mean to each other.
They are.
Right? So, anyways, to get back to your question about, like, I think adults, again, like I referred to earlier, I think part of what we do when we find people we admire is we sort of stitch ourselves into them a little bit, or stitch a bit of them into us, So if we see people who we can identify with, right, who are familiar in a way, who we see ourselves in, who are doing things that are bold or positive or, really engaged and involved, or kind of like punk, like doing things that, they're not supposed to do, then I think that's like immensely empowering. I think that children and young people, are given so much more, or so much stronger a voice in which to sort of speak and express themselves and sort of explore, if they have adult educators or just positive adult role models in their lives, with whom they can identify. So I think, again, that comes back to like representation and self-identification, right? Like, and if we see people that, again, we see people that look like us or that are like us, we see them doing amazing things, well, then that means I could do an amazing thing, So I think it's really important.
Good. We're going to be segueing towards the second part. This is actually going a little bit quicker than I thought. I should have brought more questions, I guess.
Let's see. I mean, we might get into it.
We might get into it later on. So we agree that in an educational system, a role model is really important for the development of a child, both in redefining their gender and getting into this habit of being excited about learning.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, totally.
So, with the recent rise of political strains and fascist thoughts in the United States, not naming any names that start with T, wink, wink. How important is it now to, as Audre Lorde says in the Master's Tools, the reading, to change the thought of divide and conquer to that of define and empower? Sure. How important is it to protest and make xenophobic government realize that difference is not weakness but strength? Is looking for more representation and role models a way to do this?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I think it is. I think it is so important to stand up against fascism, against discrimination, discriminatory practices, and the sort of permission that's been granted with the recent political goings-on of the United States. It's interesting, but those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it, right? So I think if we've learned anything from the past 100 years, it's that if we don't stand up against that kind of governance, then terrible things will happen, right? Like history has shown us that over and over and over again. As for the second part of that question, that's a tough one. I honestly am not sure. I can't say that I have real clear thoughts about that. Like, on one hand, again, yes, representation is very important, but I think sort of overall is looking for more representation and role models, a way to do this. I think overall, yes. But it has to be self-representation rather than being represented through the eyes of another, if that makes sense. So if we're seeing more representation in media, let's say, then I think it's important that the representation comes from the group that's being represented, rather than from, say, an outside group, or from the kind of current power paradigm, sort of wanting to sort of represent other groups, again, quote unquote. I think that's dangerous, because I think then what that is just the culture industry sort of expanding its buying base, like its buyer base, if that makes sense, right? It's just, and like RuPaul's Drag Race is kind of maybe the most, like the starkest example I can think of. And I think in Media History 206, a class we took last year, this was sort of discussed in one of the lectures, but drag is now becoming a much more mainstream and more like sort of normative, digestible kind of mode of seeing and viewing, right? Whereas again, like 20 years ago, it would have been a lot more underground. But with the case of something like RuPaul's Drag Race, which is heavily produced, and I'm sure not just by drag queens, right? I'm sure that it's not. So what ends up happening is there's all these drag queens that sort of fit into that narrow standard of female beauty, right? So it's on one hand it's reaching a broader audience, but on another hand it's sort of conforming to the same rules, in a slightly different kind of iteration.
Yeah.
So I think representation is absolutely essential, but I think it has to. I think it has to be democratic, I think, because in any subgroup you get a whole variety, right? You can't have one voice for a whole, faction of society, right? And because there's of course division and difference within every group, right? Even if it's a subgroup that, I think representation, self-representation is important, instead of being sort of represented by like the dominant white hetero patriarchal capitalist kind of eyeball, that has its eye on all things, the eye of Sauron, right?
The eye of Sauron.
Yeah.
That's a good example.
Something like that.
Yeah. Seeing that problem, those problems you were mentioning are really obvious, right? So again, reiterating how important are role models in politics. More represent orientation politics may help. How could more representation and sexual orientation in politics may help adults reconsider previous prejudice and redefine gender and sex in society?
Sure.
Like putting yourself in the shoes of a government, for example. Do you think that if you hear a lot of voices saying that we want more representation of our gender or our sex, would you start like to change any prejudice you have towards that gender or sexual orientation?
Yeah.
Even a homophobe government or a homophobe politician could actually change their point of view towards homophobia itself and be more open-minded about.
Yeah, I think as soon as we begin to view people who we would generally classify as the other, as soon as we begin to ascribe human sort of humanity and human kind of qualities and attributes, we then can immediately identify with them. You know, and again, it might sound a bit trite, but like our similarities tend to be more than our differences. You know what I mean? Like so I think that, you know, in politics and in government, you know, it's been dominated by a single voice since its inception. You know, it is government and democracy, whatever that means. You know, certainly has not been what it says that it is, right? It has been by a certain group of people for a certain group of people. So I think as soon as we start seeing a more diverse parliament, you know, then we begin to more accurately represent the world we live in. I don't live in a world run by guys in suits with ties. Like, I don't live in that world, right? I live in a world where there's people of every color and creed and every shape and every identity. You know what I mean? There isn't a single, and there's no voice that can presume to speak for all of them, you know, as our current system sort of does. I filled out a survey recently by the BC government on proportional representation, which I feel is a very good idea in a country like Canada, especially, that is humongous.
Yeah.
Like, just literally, we have to pause before we say that word because it's so humongous. We're so diverse. We're such a small population, right, that we can't possibly hope to be represented fairly in government with the current system as it is. I think, like many other things in politics, in federal politics, it starts provincially, and it works its way up. So I'm excited by the idea, anyways, of proportional representation in government and just seeing a greater diversity of voices in Parliament. My husband is Dutch, and in the Dutch Parliament, there's something silly. I'm going to greatly exaggerate this because I don't know the number, but there's something like 34 political parties in the Netherlands. Yeah, like something. It's a number that it was staggering. Now, I don't think they're all represented in Parliament. Something like 16 represented in Parliament. Like, so there's always coalition going on. There's always. And I'm not trying to say that the Dutch state is in any way perfect. But in many ways, the Dutch are, I think, because of this cooperative, like this sort of forced cooperative nature of their government, they are kind of quite forward in many ways. They were the first to legalize gay marriage.
Yeah,
Canada was 10th, right? Like, Holland was first. The Netherlands. So
I think actually Mexico beat you as well.
Yeah, right? Like, I mean, it's good that we jumped on there, but like we weren't first or second or third or fourth, you know? So I think in many ways cooperation forces us to acknowledge our difference and to work through that, and to sort of to answer your question, to understand each other in a more embodied kind of way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like privilege is your blindness, right? Privilege is what you don't have to think about other people's lives and how they suffer and how they, that's privilege, right? And and it's hard to see through that, when you've never had to, when nobody's ever said, hey, so yeah, I don't know. I'm an eternal optimist. I'd rather be an optimist and wrong than a pessimist and right. You know what I mean? So I see the good things, I think, happening, and I see things moving towards a more inclusive and a different way of maybe governance. It runs kind of contra to Lorde's idea. And I don't know what a system would look like, or I don't know what it would look like, if we were to sort of, again, if we're thinking about the master's house, how would we organize ourselves outside of that? I think that would require some real sort of social anarchy.
Yeah.
Do I think it can be done?
Well,
shit, yeah. Like, if we look at the course of human history and the crazy shit that we have accomplished or done, or like think about Genghis Khan and like a third of the world's population being related to that guy. Like that's incredible.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
incredible.
Like that's incredible. So like, is it possible to have great societal overhauls and change for better? Yes, I believe it is. How? I don't know. I have no idea.
Well, we're gonna go with the how now.
Yeah, great.
So, going again with Audre Lorde,
Yeah.
she also says that a way the oppressor maintains the oppressed is by making them try to explain their needs, avoiding the need to educate themselves.
Sure.
So, in other words, they don't have to educate themselves. They just make the other guys try to tell them and stuff. So, so if that's the case, is more representation in politics a way to take away their excuse to not educate themselves? Or are we just are we just adding logs to the fire? Like, are we giving them more excuses to not educate themselves?
Sure. Well, I think it depends on, the idea of a critical mass. So when, let's say when difference outnumbers same, and I use those terms in terms of like the way that things have normally been or historically been structured. So
okay.
When there's more like
the normative structure.
Sure. When there's more like fat, black, queer women in parliament than there are straight white men, then I think the power dynamic has to shift. There has to be a critical, again, that idea of critical mass, like a certain sort of
boil.
It's something like that. It has like about a certain sort of like percentage of representation. If you hit over a certain kind of like, there's a number where things begin to, the power shifts, the dynamic shifts. So I think, until that happens, I think the idea of like electing more people who aren't straight white dudes, you know what I mean? Electing more candidates that come from diverser communities and orientations and experiences. Until that happens, until that critical mass of representation happens in governmental bodies, and I suppose until that happens, I don't know. Like, I don't know if it's just adding more fuel to the fire. If it is.
So in the short term, we're not really sure if it's adding or not, but we might find out later on in the long term.
Yeah, and I think if it keeps happening, and again, there's a certain kind of awareness that is unavoidable with, again, that certain kind of statistic, like statistical numbers in terms of like bodies in seats, right?
Yeah.
So if you are, say you're a member of parliament and you've been a member of parliament for 16 years or 3 or 4 terms, something like this, right? And you keep getting reelected, you do a fine job or whatever. And in your seat in the House of Commons, for all these years, you look around and you see basically yourself. You would see an occasional, maybe you see someone with a different skin tone, or maybe you see someone that's a woman, or, maybe you see these occasional sort of like different people, but for mostly it's you. You're sitting there in a room full of you. So imagine if over time, maybe 1 or 2 elections, that starts to change, and we start seeing more brown faces, we start seeing more female faces, we see faces we can't figure out what they are, does it matter, right? Then I think you begin to question more things. When the world around you and your direct sort of environment shows diversity, I think you become more aware of diversity. If you live in a world where you're exposed only to a sort of like a hegemonic, right, this like monoculture, you don't think about it much, or you're not forced to. And again, this sort of privilege, being our blindness, we often, as a species, we don't look at our privilege, or we don't look at, unless we have to, unless somebody puts a mirror up and says, look at this, So yeah, I don't know, but I think exposure is important, and I think if you there's lots of good people, like not bad people out there in the world who maybe perpetuate ideas or behaviors that are not helpful or positive,
Yeah.
And it's in a way, it's their fault, like engage critically, but in a way too, they've never even been taught that they can think critically, if that makes sense. I think about like my grandmother. She was a lovely human being. She was a nice person, and she was loving, and she cared, and she wouldn't have thought, like, just the ideas, some of these ideas that we're thinking about would have just been like what? Like, so I think exposure is really important.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, it can't hurt to have more representation and diversity in whatever sort of, institutional body, whatever that is.
Yeah.
Like on the wall back there, what does what kind of president should ECU have? So it's a new the current president is retiring this year, and he's been here since like 1995 or 6, I think. And like, so I've got this job in the archives, and I've been studying institutional facts. And since our inception as an institution in 1925, we've had one female president, one non-male president, and she was an interim. She co-presidented, if that's a word, with this other guy, just until they could find someone new. But basically, every president of Emily Carr University, in all of its different iterations, has been a white man. What do we need now? Not a white man, right? Let's get something a bit different going on here. Let's get women, let's get people of color, queer people. Let's get people who have been underrepresented in positions of power, influence, and decision. Let's get them in the chairs, man. I want to see what they have to say and how they would do things, right? Like, we have a bit of an idea of how a white guy would do it. Great, here we are. But let's try something different.
Making a note here. Yeah. Gonna run for president. First Mexican to be president of Emily Carr. There we go.
There we go. Right? That's something a bit different.
That is something a bit different. Okay, I can see that. Okay, so we can agree that it's seeing more representation out there is actually a good thing, and we might not know if it's adding if it's adding to the fire, or if it's actually helping.
Yeah.
But we can stay positive that it's a good thing.
I think so.
And we can hope for a better future.
Yeah, I think more good than bad, right?
Yeah.
And again, I think self-representation is quite important,
Yeah.
Like the ability to represent any group, any marginalized group needs their own voice. They don't need, because that's just been the paradigm for so long is, like, I'm a white European benefactor, let me speak for you, people of, like, shush, right?
Exactly. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting in a way. Segueing or moving on to the next part of this,
Sure.
Third and final part, it's about the media.
Okay.
And going with what we last said about representation and whatnot, how do we see this and whatnot? going again with Judith Butler again in her feminist phenomenology theory. Gender in a according to her, gender in a non-theatrical performance is more scrutinized than that of a theatrical gender, because when it's said that it's just an act, it derealizes the act, and one keeps its reality in this temporary challenge to their prejudice in gender.
Of course.
So, she's saying that, is it true of all media though? What about normalization of gender in TV and film, like bringing up transgender and normalizing it, not just making it the enemy, making it part of us.
Sure.
What about music and radio, even like hip hop and all these other genres of music that try to bring discussion about sexual orientation and gender and whatnot.
Sure, different perspectives.
So would these actually not affect that? Like, would we keep our own reality and prejudice according to Judith Butler, or would we actually see, like in the previous question, would we actually see change, and would we change with it?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and I
this
think,
is in media, not in politics, in media.
Right, yeah, in media. I think that quote that you pulled is totally right on. I think when we're looking at a kind of a reconstruction of the world, when we're watching something that we know isn't real, quote unquote, film, television, theater, I think we do suspend our prejudices or our maybe our politics, right? We can kind of, maybe there's more wiggle room than when we're confronted with it in a reality, you know what I mean? Like on the street. Like, I think it's one thing to see a transgendered person represented in a film, and it's a different thing to have a transgendered person as a neighbor. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think for some people, and obviously because trans people experience so much violence, you know, it's not a comfortable relationship, like sort of personal, you know. I think seeing it in media, again, I think, you know, I think representation is important, and it is good in media. I mean, media tends to be like the dominant mode of culture, of like culture sort of transmission, if we were, like in our day and age, right? We watch films, we listen to podcasts, we listen to the radio, music, you know, it's how we sort of understand and maybe orient ourselves in the world. So yeah, I don't know, you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a tough one. I think
it is a really tough one.
I think, again, like seeing a diversity, hearing a diversity of voices can never be a bad thing. I think we're all at a sort of a different level in terms of how much we're willing to sort of be open to the voice of the other or the different. You know what I mean? So I think it really depends on the person. I think that certain people are going to be maybe more malleable in terms of their position or their political views based on what they're exposed to in media. But I think there's also a lot of media that just reinforces the dominant paradigm as we know it as well, right? So it's a tough one. I think media is certainly powerful. Media is very powerful. I think music, I kind of had a little moment of panic when you started asking about music, because music is just so, like, I think music carries such a weight and such a power to influence, and sort of, like, because it's sort of pure abstraction in a way, right? It has no tangible existence. You know what I mean? It can be so moving. So certainly media is powerful, and it exerts a great deal of influence over our lives. And if we, I think that it's problematic when dominant modes represent or normalize sexism or homophobia, transphobia, discrimination of any kind. And, like hip-hop, I'm looking at you. And you can't, of course, paint right? You can't paint with one broad stroke, as the saying goes. But, when you have the capacity to influence a great number, I think, like who said, with great power comes great responsibility, something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So if you have the ability to reach out and to influence a lot of people, then I think you also have a responsibility to represent in an ethical kind of way. And I think a lot of the dominant modes of media are not. They don't represent ethically. You know what I mean? Sexism abounds, racism abounds, stereotyping, homophobia, transphobia. It's getting better. I will say that because, we are hearing about transgender directors, actors, who are making careers for themselves, and being proudly, vocally, transgendered. So yeah, it's changing. But I think all of these things are really quite, they're quite complicated and they're quite fraught, you know what I mean? And I think that there's always going to be a positive and a negative, there's going to be sort of things that are good, but also things that are sort of, working in opposite or in opposition to those, right? So, but yeah, I mean, media is tremendously impactful. And how we orient ourselves in what media, what we're exposed to, and I think really has a strong effect on who we become and our worldview. I was raised by hippies, so I was exposed to a lot of like alternative cinema, music, like real alt kind of at the time. So for me, the ideas of, I don't know, it's not that hard, like it's a bit more like, well, yeah, this is how things are. But I think for someone, again, who never was exposed to that, especially as a child, it's going to be harder.
Yes.
So, yeah, I don't know, in media, we tend to sort of group ourselves in terms of how we orient ourselves within media, what kind of music we like, what kind of films we like, that becomes a sort of a major identifier for us, right? So, and then we seek out others in that same kind of, with those same kind of markers. So yeah, tremendously impactful. Can be for good or for evil, I will say, right? That's a mixed bag.
Yeah, it's a double-faced coin. Mm-hmm. It can be one or the other.
Yeah, I think it's often both.
It's something. Well, it can fall and not one
not
side
fall.
on the other. Not fall at all.
Right? Sit on its edge. Yeah, which is, I think, probably what it does for many of us, right?
So, okay, going with that, I pulled up a online article by B.G. Carter that has to do with network television and cancellation of Young Justice and shows like those.
Okay.
So, according to this online article by B.G. Carter, a major decision for cartoon content are toys, and apparently that also determines the gender of the demographic they're trying to sell to.
Sure.
Where girls don't buy toys as much as boys, so most shows get canceled when majority of viewers are girls.
Wow.
How true is this statement? Why does toys have to be gender locked, and how does that affect gender construction? Pay in mind that toys can also be role models, like depending on the show.
Of course.
So I actually think it's a little bit messed up that role models are gender locked.
It's totally fucked up.
Right?
Yeah.
So how true is this statement, and how do you think this affects gender construction?
Well, I mean, I'm the mother of a boy child, or at least of a male child, who at this point seems to sort of espouse many of those very typical like boy-child characteristics. He's young still, right? So, but at this point, yeah, I'd say that I have a male identifying child. And one of the hardest things as a parent who's critically engaged and who's at least trying to parent quite mindfully and in opposition of some of these strong categorizing sorts of institutional thoughts. It's like Prometheus pushing that rock up that mountain, Is that him? Yeah. It's really fascinating and horrifying to see just how incredibly gendered toys are and how in such well-engineered and well-marketed ways just tell children exactly what it means to be a girl or a boy. And it describes these qualities and these characteristics so young before we even understand what they're doing. And it's kind of perverse, actually. It's kind of perverse, and it's really difficult to push against that current as a parent. Again, it is getting better because there are more parents out there who are like, this is fucked. Like the Bratz dolls for girls.
Oh, I remember those.
Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Like, they have these, they're like, I don't know, they're like these, like, strange, like, Barbie, like, with these huge eyes, and they've got these legs, and they're all wearing thong underpants and, like, tiny little skirts.
It's like somebody asked the question, how could Barbie be more objectifying of beauty? Let's do the Bratz doll.
Let's do the Bratz dolls. Like, it's just incredible. And if I were the mother to a daughter, it would be a cold day in hell before I let my daughter play with any of that shit. With my son, it's maybe a little bit easier because of what he's interested in, like the natural world. So we have a lot of toys that are like that aren't necessarily gender like prescribed or gender ascribed. Like he likes Playmobil animals, sort of. But like I also find it with clothing. There's always a greater selection for girls than for boys. For boys, it's this limited. It's like army stripes or dinosaurs or machines, or like sharks.
Yeah, I can actually put a note here. When I was a boy, I was actually jealous of the amount of clothing my sister could get.
Right.
I was like, why can't I wear a dress?
Why don't I get to?
Yeah. So yeah, Side note, I did a bet once.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
This is in junior high. I did a bet where if I lose, I would wear a dress.
Okay.
Of course, I lost. So I wore a dress,
yeah.
But I wasn't that affected by it. I was like, this is great. I'm wearing a dress.
They're pretty comfortable too, right?
I know.
Dresses are really nice. I don't know why men can't wear dresses too. Like, I get to wear pants. Why don't you get to wear a dress? Like, it doesn't make any... It's just a piece of clothing.
We need more Scotsmen.
Yeah, maybe that's it. Like, the kilt is like this... It's like the gateway... The gateway clothing into wearing skirts, right? But this is it. I mean, this is like... I think advertising towards children should be illegal. I think marketing towards children should be illegal because we're marketing to psyches that are underdeveloped. And kids know what they want, but they sure as shit don't know what they need. Right? Like, I have saved my son's life 400,000 times in his short time on this planet because children just fucking go. They just throw themselves, and then you're an asshole because you don't let them swim in the duck pond. You know what I mean? Like, then they're like, I hate you, and you're like, oh, really? You want fucking dysentery? Like, stop sassing me. You can't go swimming in the duck slough. Like, fucking kids. They know what they want, but they don't know what they need. And advertising towards these, like, young, like, I read that a child's brain in development, the first 6 years of development, especially in their first year of development, their brain in a day works more than mine will in a year, right? There's just so much going on. And to chuck this marketing at these children, I think is, criminal. It's made me as a parent so cognizant of what media my son consumes. And it's gotten to a point where he doesn't actually get to watch. He gets to watch nature shows or a show that we watch together called Luxury Comedy, which is this. It's totally adult content, but he loves it. It's just this absurdist, strange little comedy show. It makes no sense. But for me, that's a safer bet, like going into absurdity and surrealism, than it is to go into like G.I. fucking Joe or something like war. Like, fuck that. Are you kidding me? I'd rather he watch some like this like pure creative absurdist little show that's got like some curse words over, you know, a show that promotes violence and domination and patriarchy and capitalism, you know, and consumption. Like, no, right? So, like, media, and you can see it. You can start to see it. My son's only 7, but you can start to see it in the kids, I think, whose parents aren't as aware or aren't as moderating as we are. That, like, already they understand their roles. They understand who they are and who they have to be, you know? And it's a bit scary. It's a bit surreal and strange. I never thought about it as a child. But looking at it now with adult eyes onto this sort of like this world of these children, yeah, it makes me even more determined to sort of shield and shelter my son from that kind of concreting idea that just because he's a boy means X, Y, Z, right? Or just because one of his friends is a girl means X, Y, Z. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's no rules. This is often what I say to him about gender. There are no rules. Just because you're a girl doesn't mean you can't, and just because you're a boy doesn't mean you can't, right? There's no rules. Remember, there's big girls and there's little boys.
Yeah.
Fat boys and skinny girls. Fat girls, skinny boys. Like you're going to see every kind of person represented.
Yeah.
And so the quicker you can remove the idea that there are rules about gender, I think the better off he'll be. But it is definitely an uphill battle, and I have to say, like, you have to repeat things 80,000 times, and that's not even exaggerating. Through the course of his life, there are no rules with gender. Go brush your teeth and put your shoes on. Like, those are the things I say. I will, by the time he's 18, 100,000 times. He'll only have listened to 2,000 or 3,000 of them now.
So, revisiting the first question in this section,
Sure.
The one where normalization of gender in TV and
Sure.
film and whatnot.
Sure.
What about recent cartoons, such as Steven Universe and Star vs. the Forces of Evil and so on, which challenges tropes and archetypes regarding gender roles,
Sure.
basically redefine what gender is to the level of comprehension of a child?
Sure.
Are these positive role models?
Well, you know, I don't have any direct experience with any of those, so I can't say like directly. But I think that would if again, like it's representation, and it's sort of about what is treated as being normal in the world. You know, is homosexuality normal? Yeah. Is transgenderedness or is being transgendered normal? Yes. Natural, right? Does it happen in the human animal? Well, then it's normal. You know what I mean? So I think that in a way, normalizing ideas of difference is a good thing. And again, representation. And you know, God love them. There's like, excuse me.
It's okay.
There's you know, God love the hippie, anarchist, queer writers and animators. You know, and those you know, the people. Some of the people at this institution who you know, will carry on in their careers to make subversive, you know, funny, challenging art, you know, and maybe some of it will hit mainstream and maybe some of it will, you know what I mean? But I think, yeah, and it's kind of the beauty of the internet right now too, right, is that it's this like great web that can't really be shut down. You know, it can't be sort of like really moderated. Yeah. You know, one faction shuts down and then there's 15 different other sort of, you know, connectors coming at it, you know. So the control of media has certainly changed in the past 20 years. But yeah, you know, if you're a transgendered animator and you want to make a kids show about what it was like for you growing up, or like maybe the utopic idea of what it would be like as a transgendered kid to grow up, you know, fuck yeah, do that. And yes, will I let my son watch that? Absolutely. You know, again, I would rather he watch that than some animated show about fucking Tonka trucks that are dinosaurs, you know, about resource extraction and, you know, like, there's so many things that we've just normalized.
Is there a show like that?
Yeah, it's called Dino Trucks. Dino Tracks,
no.
yeah. And it just like normalizes all these ideas, you know, about consumption and resources and land use and, you know, it just like so subtly, so sublimely. So yeah, you know, if we can have shows that represent a greater diversity of voices and that represent a world that is more, you know, in line with the world that we actually live in, then I think that would be, it's fantastic. You know what I mean? We have to sort of get ourselves out of this, like, again, this dominant mode of seeing and representing, because it's not fucking working, right? Clearly, it's not working. It's not working for the little boys out there, and it's not working for the little girls out there, right? And it's not working for all the people in between, right? Who are both or neither, you know? Like, I think we're getting to a stage in human sort of consciousness where we are beginning to erase these boundaries that exist in our minds. And all, you know, the only way that I can see that is as positive. I heard this article on CBC the other day. I was listening to this interview, I guess, on CBC about this man who was who was part of this project, was a group of like dedicated nerds who are trying to create the largest family tree in the world to represent the fact that we're all cousins. We're all related to each other. And, you know, if we can view each other as familial, the way that we relate to each other changes, right? So I think we are getting to some interesting spots in human consciousness, you know, where ideas that I grew up with as being quite normal are totally being rocked and challenged, and they should be, right? Because they're fucking horseshit. You know, and we all struggle with it, I think, unless you're that 1 in 800,000 people who is, you know, naturally very slender, large-breasted, blonde, 5'10", you know, thin, naturally thin, you know, unless you're that one of those people, which most of us are not, then you've struggled with existing outside of this, you know, idealized kind of notion, right?
Yeah.
And I think that we're all just going to have a better time if we feel like we're okay the way we are, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And I think, you know, and I think that's true of children, and I think it's true of adults, right? So yeah. I think I would encourage all of the weirdos and the misfits and the punks to like fucking keep going, you know, keep doing it, because we need those voices, right? We need them. It's important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the final question,
okay.
And it's a concluding question,
okay.
To bring all of
bring
this
it all
together.
Back together.
What are your hopes for the future? Like seeing all the problems we have, seeing all the solutions that are coming up, seeing the ways in we can change. We challenge these narratives and whatnot. Sure. What's the hope? What's your hope for the future?
Well, again, like I said earlier, I'm an eternal optimist. So I am very hopeful for the future. I think if I wasn't hopeful for the future, it would have been an asshole move to have a child. What do I hope? I hope for a more sort of like a more reasonable, and that's sort of a difficult word to use, but like a more reasonable approach to our interrelation with each other and with the world. A less frantic approach. I'd like to see things, you know, the sort of priority of governments and of maybe of people shifting away from acquisition to fun, absurdity, you know, to things that are moving but unexplainable or unquantifiable, you know, unspeakable. Yeah, I would just like to see the world sort of be gentler on itself and on each other, the world, like the human world. I think I'd like to see us be more gentle on each other and on ourselves and on our environment, and just a gentler sort of approach. Everything seems so aggressive and so, it's so us and them, it's so binary, it's so fraught with difference and with opposition and separation, and I don't think that's how it actually is, So I think a gentler, it's going to sound a bit trite again, and it's going to sound like me because I blab on a lot about being a mom, but I think about this sometimes. I think you could put me in a room, for example, you put me in a room with 50 other women. We could come from every age and background of religious affiliation, creed, color, culture, huge representation. What would be the things that would sort of bind us together? And I think, and again, it's very difficult to speak universally, but I think one of the most powerful forces that exists in the world is love of your children. And I don't think it matters where you come from. If I saw another woman suffering for the loss of a child, or, I would want to help with that because I could immediately identify with that. So I think, again, maybe that's just about recognition of what's similar about us, even while accepting, acknowledging and making room for what's different. There are things that would bring us together in a pinch, as the saying goes. So I think maybe just a greater responsiveness to that inclination to be bonded by what we're, a smile is universal.
Yeah.
A mom giving a kid shit in whatever language it is, that kid's catching hell, right? Like there's certain things that you're like, ooh, don't piss your mom off, kid, right? Like you probably deserve that. There's certain things that, just like that help bond us to a situation, a person, We don't have to share anything else. Culture, economics, background, race, So, yeah, I think maybe just more space for those connections.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, yep. Thank you very much about that. I appreciate having this interview with you.
Yeah, you're welcome.